Just want to begin by acknowledging, regretting the absence of Professor Bernard Jackson, who was supposed to speak before me. I was very excited that I was speaking on the same panel because, or at least with his presence, because he's been, as somebody who was a pioneer in the field of legal semiotics, and especially Jewish legal semiotics, Dr. Jackson has been among the most generous, constructive critics of my work, and I was looking forward to his constructive criticism here. I have since been pleased to learn there are other members of the conference who know a thing or two about semiotics, so I'm hoping that you will fill that role. For those of you who are not familiar with semiotics, I hope that I will manage to convince you that semiotics is not simply another discipline full of strange terms and concepts that you have to master to be part of a certain kind of academic discourse, but that it actually constitutes a useful and I think very powerful set of tools for conceptual analysis. My paper tries to directly address one of the questions that was posed in the call for papers, namely how to conceive of law and religion as two orientations or sensibilities, or I actually prefer the term that a lot of speakers have used, discourses. I think semiotics is uniquely fit to do that because semiotics provides a very technical and precise definition of what a discourse is, and therefore allows us to talk about the features of different kinds of discourses and how they're similar to or different from one another. The paper is organized in three sections. First of all, I'm well aware that I have to give an introduction to what semiotics is and how semiotics defines a discourse. The second part, I want to define the semiotic concept of what I've chosen to call and other people call canonicity. In the third section, I want to talk about some of the semiotic features of legal and religious discourse, and I want to pose my main thesis, which is that one of the key characteristics of both legal and religious discourse is they are both strongly canonical systems, and I want to do that by contrasting each one with a parallel system which is weakly canonical, religion with science, and law with morality. Semiotics. The proper subject of semiotics is the sign, which Ferdinand de Saussure defines as any discrete, repeatable physical form. A sign can be simple, which is to say irreducible to smaller sign units. A phoneme, a letter, a physical action can all be simple signs, or it can be complex, which is to say a sign that can be broken down into component signs. A word, a statement, a text, a composite image are all examples of complex signs. One of the basic tenets of semiotics is that meaning is not inherent in the form of the sign, but rather a product of the relationship between signs. And hence, one of the key areas that semiotics delves into is the importance of semiotic systems. The way that systems of signs are critical to understanding the meaning of any sign within that system. Language is one example, maybe, according to some semioticians, a paradigmatic example of a semiotic system, but any system that conveys information through the medium of discrete repeatable forms can be the subject of semiotic analysis. So for example, law is the subject of semiotic analysis not only because law is often conveyed through language, but more importantly and more fundamentally because law is the set of terms, texts, images, practices, rituals, which are used to create meaning and convey information. And the same can obviously be said of any of the discourses that constitute human culture, the sciences, religion, the arts, material culture, can all be the subject of semiotic analysis. An essential aspect of any sign system is that its structure is a network rather than a hierarchy. Sign systems generate meaning through patterns of similarity and difference between the component signs of the system, and it's only these patterns that create meaning for any one particular sign in the system. Meaning can be analyzed as the position or the range of the sign within the system. As Umberto Eco, I was conscious of doing that for the Italians, not say Umberto, semiotic values issue from within the system itself. They are not defined in terms of content, but in terms of the way in which they are opposed to other elements of the system and of the position which they occupy within it. Close quote. Saussure demonstrates this with very simple kinds of linguistic signs, words, phonemes, etc. Other semioticians, Julia Kristeva, Michel Foucault, demonstrate that the same kind of analysis can be done with complex systems of signs, such as statements and texts. And therefore, it's one perspective on at least this branch of semiotics is that semiotics takes the tools that linguists use to analyze language and applies it to higher order discourses. Semiotics provides not only a technical definition of a discourse as a network of complex signs, but also, I think, gives a very compelling definition of what it means for two things to be distinct discourses. Consider the often controversial example of the relationship between law and morality. It is very tempting sometimes to treat law and morality as two poles within one normative system, or morality as providing the principles that undergird or support legal reasoning. And yet we can all acknowledge that there are certain actions that we define as morally good but illegal, or legally permissible but morally reprehensible. In other words, we assign different moral and legal, or we can assign different moral and legal values to particular actions or other kinds of signs. And essentially that's what it means for them to be different discourses. You can't speak of an action being simultaneously legal and illegal, or moral and immoral, but you can speak of an action having different legal and moral values. The same is true for religion and science. In the appendix to his book, The Sacred Canopy, sociologist Peter Berger observes that if one thinks of religion as reflecting, quote, the human capacity for self-transcendence, one could, in theory, use that definition to talk about science. Obviously, that's not very helpful, as Berger comments. If one does that, one is subsequently forced to define in what way modern science is different from what has been called religion by everybody else. In other words, the fact that we categorize instinctively certain kinds of statements about the world as either religious or scientific tells us that those have to functionally be treated as different discourses. It's not a statement about ontology, it's simply a statement about how these systems function within human society. The distinction between different discourses leads us to the problem of demarcation. What is it? What form features about certain statements cause us or prompt us to define them as scientific or religious? And that's something that I hope to get back to later in the paper. It also raises the problem of translation, which is something that we keep coming up again and again, where signs are translated or transferred from one system to another. I think this was very relevant to what Sylvia was talking about this morning, where time periods that have religious significance then bleed into legal significance. I think it's relevant to what Yedida was talking about yesterday in terms of the category of mamzer being transferred from one discourse to another, and I think comes up very often. Unfortunately, I don't want to address that today. Okay, what do I mean when I talk about semiotic canonicity? The notion that meaning is dependent on a network of signs affects the way that we analyze the evolution or development of any kind of discourse. One of Sacher's major contributions to linguistics was his insistence that language has to be analyzed first and foremost synchronically and only then diachronically. That's not because language doesn't change, obviously language evolves, but rather because, quote, language is a system of pure values determined by nothing else apart from the temporary state of its constituent elements. That is to say, from a semiotic perspective, any system of meaning is all structure. Without a clear picture of the relationship between the component signs in the system at any point in time, there's no thing to analyze. Hence, the existence of any language or higher level discourse depends on there being an accumulated body of signs to constitute the system and ensure its stability over time. This property of semiotic systems, the fact that there has to be an accumulated body of signs to constitute the system in order for it to function, is at least one aspect, and maybe the central aspect, of what we refer to as canonicity. I should explain. I'm using canonicity different than the way that we sometimes refer to a canon as a set of exemplary signs in a system, as an artistic canon or a literary canon, or even in law, where a canon can be a set of cases or laws that are frequently quoted in legal discourse, or in science, where there's a set of exemplary experiments or models that are usually cited. Canonicity, in the sense that I'm using it, is a basic property of all signs of any semiotic system. And essentially I mean that once a sign is accepted as an element of the system, once a word is recognized as having currency within a language, once a statement is endorsed as being correct within a particular discourse, that statement tends to adhere within the system over time. Moshe Halbertal refers to this as formative canonicity, so I guess you can use that to distinguish it from exemplary canonicity, or within a legal system from normative canonicity. In other words, formative canonicity is the fact that semiotic systems have elements that continue to be taught, read, transmitted, and interpreted over time, and effectively function as the shared vocabulary. That's Halbertal's term. The shared vocabulary of a given group of people, a given profession. That's essentially what I mean by formative canonicity. The way that the signs of the system constitute a shared language, a shared vocabulary that constitutes the system and ensures its stability over time. And in effect, what we can say, there's a wonderful quote here from Julia Kristeva, in effect, canonicity changes the relationship or the dynamic of any semiotic system with relation to time. Because what was diachronic, the fact that different signs enter the system at different points in time, once they're in the system, they become synchronic. Diachrony is, quote, diachrony is transformed into synchrony, and in light of this transformation, linear history appears as an abstraction. Essentially, canonicity changes the way that we perceive of a system and its evolution over time. It's really important to note that this aspect of semiotic systems, the canonicity of semiotic systems, is not a feature of an authority. Authority figures often control, or exert some measure of control, over how new signs enter into a system. Obviously, law and religion are both good examples of this. You have legal authorities, you have religious authorities that control when new signs, how new signs, new actions, new practices, new texts, new liturgies, new laws enter into a system. But once they're part of the system, they tend to adhere within the system, and that's not a function of authority. Again, come back to language. Language is a perfect example of a very egalitarian and public system. Nobody endorses a word because it was somebody decided to put it in the dictionary, or the Academy for Hebrew Language decided this is going to be a word. Words acquire currency by being used, and yet languages very clearly have a very high degree of formative canonicity, which allows us to have a shared language and communicate. If canonicity is a central property of all semiotic systems, I think it's also important to appreciate that it's also a variable property. That is to say, some kinds of semiotic systems have strong degrees of canonicity and others have weak degrees of canonicity. Again, this does not result in a kind of static discourse. Just because if we say that law, as I'm going to say, has a strong degree of canonicity, it doesn't mean law is static. You can change the system by introducing new elements, which then complicates the internal dynamic of the system. It changes the internal network of the system. What it means, though, is that law tends to be conservative. The elements of the system tend to adhere within it. New elements do not displace existing elements, and existing elements tend not to become obsolete. Systems that have weak canonicity, the opposite is true. New elements come into the system, and those have a tendency to displace existing elements, and also elements have a tendency to fall out of use of their own accord. As I said at the outset, my basic thesis is that what law, an important feature of what law and religion share, is that they are both strongly canonical, albeit for different reasons, which I hope I will have time to elaborate on. Yes. Albeit for different reasons. In other words, law and religion, because of their different constitutions, both share this common feature of having strong canonicity. And again, I want to contrast that with science and religion, which have weak degrees of canonicity. Sorry?
Science and religion?
Science and morality. Did I say religion? I'm sorry. Morality. This is important not only because it helps us understand the dynamics of law and religion in terms of how they relate to change in society, but also because it helps us to explain something that we've all been circling around and talking about for the past 2 days, which is what causes law and religion to have this kind of affinity with one another. Because semiotics defines discourses in terms of their constituent elements, we have to take a minute to analyze what are the key elements of any religious and legal discourse. And here I realize I'm going to get a little reductive. There is only so much time. But I hope you'll stay with me, and I hope you'll see the advantage of the approaches that I'm taking. It's self-evident that no discourse is limited to one kind of sign. There are different kinds of statements that we categorize as legal or religious or scientific or moral. But I think we can talk about the elements that constitute a minimal discourse. What's the minimum elements that we need to define a discourse as legal or religious or scientific or moral? The definition of religion, for example, I realize is highly contentious in scholarship. I do think, however, that any religious system needs to have some conception of existence and humanity's position in it. And therefore, I want to say that the minimal element of any religious discourse is a set of descriptive statements about existence. Okay? In other words, religion is irreducibly descriptive, even if it also has many prescriptive elements. In contrast, I think it's self-evident to say that law is irreducibly prescriptive, because its most basic elements are a set of rules. I realize that this complicates things that Valentino talked about this morning. I have a lot to say about that, but I don't want to address it right now. So again, religion is irreducibly descriptive, and law is irreducibly prescriptive. Why does that make religion or what about that makes religion and law strongly canonical? Religion is obviously not just about descriptive elements. There are certain kinds of statements that we've described as descriptive. And here again, we get to the problem of demarcating religion from science, for example. Science is never a discourse that is irreducibly descriptive. It's a set of descriptive statements about the world. What makes a statement scientific versus religious? The problem of demarcation is one that has occupied the minds of not only philosophers of religion, but also philosophers of science. And I think one of the most fundamental theories about philosophy of science, in demarcating it from other disciplines, is Karl Popper's observation that scientific statements are fundamentally falsifiable. That is to say, an essential part of what it means for a statement to have scientific meaning is the idea, a statement, a model, a set of data. What does it mean for it to have scientific meaning? It means that it can be contradicted by other empirical evidence. The idea of throwing out data or theories or models is integral to scientific meaning and therefore an essential part of scientific discourse. And it's what makes scientific discourse progressive rather than conservative. I realize that Popper's model has been challenged in some ways by Kuhn, and Kuhn subsequently by his critics. I do think, however, this is an element of Popper's theory that has stood the test of time. And I want to suggest that an essential component of what makes a statement religious is the fact that it is unfalsifiable, at least in contemporary discourse. In other words, an essential element of what it means for a statement to be religious is that it is fundamentally not subject to being falsified or rejected or challenged. And when I say that, it's not only about statements about belief, it's also about atheists. I don't think I could convince an atheist, no matter how many miracles I pull out of my hat, that God really exists. Because for an atheist, disbelief in God, or belief that there is no God, is also an unfalsifiable proposition. And I think you see this in the way that religion and science respond to challenge. Thomas Kuhn, of course, in Structure of Scientific Revolutions, talks a lot about how challenges impact the dynamics of scientific discourse. Obviously, there's always a certain amount of resistance, but when a scientific challenge, when a challenge to a given scientific paradigm is successful, it replaces the old paradigm. Whereas in religion, when a religious challenge is successful, the result is not undermining or replacing the old religion, but usually, I think the overwhelming majority of the time, the founding of a new religion or a new sect alongside the old. In the 1 minute I have left, I want to talk about what makes law canonical.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. An essential element of legal discourse, again, this is a little reductionist, but I hope not too reductionist, is the notion that law, the paramount importance of consistency of adjudication within law. I think many of the things we call law, including scientific laws and other kinds of laws, are fundamentally about consistency in application or consistency of certain phenomena. Consistency demands not only that a legal system decide all similar cases the same way at any point in time, but also that every new case that arises be decided consistently with previous cases. That's why laws, when they're on the books, tend to remain on the books. And that's also why, within the adjudication of new cases that are not addressed, there is always some significance, not always decisive, by an appeal to tradition, convention, or status quo. It is always meaningful, again, not always decisive, but meaningful, to say to a judge, but it's always been done this way, within legal discourse. In sum, the conservative tendency, therefore, of legal discourse is hardwired into the system and not necessarily, or not fundamentally, the product of the intransigence of legal authorities. Now, my most controversial point, it's also a point that I've written a lot about and therefore feel comfortable saying in the last 30 seconds, which is that morality, at least common morality, is fundamentally progressive. I realize the definition of morality is equally subject to a lot of scholarly contention, and I'm working here with the model of a moral philosopher named Bernard Goethe. Some of you may have heard of him. He wrote a wonderful book called Morality, Its Nature, and Justification. I think that Goethe, I value Goethe's theory because I think he offers what is the most fundamental distinction between morality and law, which is that law is formal and morality is fundamentally informal. And by calling morality informal, what he means is that morality, quote, has no authoritative judges and no decision procedure that provides unique answers to all moral questions. In effect, what Goethe is saying is the consistency in decision-making is fundamentally not a feature of moral discourse. And I think this goes back to what one of the things that Chaim said yesterday about moral reasoning, that moral reasoning is able to take into account elements of a case that law is not, because morality doesn't have to worry about being consistent between different cases. I think this speaks to a basic truth about the way that we engage in moral reasoning. Moral reasoning is fundamentally not about consistency between cases. It's about the dynamics of this particular case and the kinds of harm or benefit it will have to the people that it affects. I have more to say about law and religion and the affinity between them, but I think I'll stop here and just say that I think this element of strong canonicity is something that binds law and religion together. And also results in conflicts, not only contrasts, but also conflicts with other elements of society, especially science and morality, as I've described. Thank you very much.